In this clip, we're going to be discussing a few rules that will be useful in dealing with questions involving vector algebra. In vector algebra, you're given vectors without a 2D grid. So there is no indication as to the individual component of the vectors. Let us consider two vectors, Q and P. Then to work out the resultant of this vector, I can either work out P plus Q, or I could have achieved my resultant vector in a different way by working out Q plus P. This is called the commutative rule for the addition of vectors. It is an important rule to remember for tackling GCSE exam questions involving vectors. By extension, for any three vectors P, Q, and R, this rule also applies. So it does not matter which order you add them in, you will get or you will end up in exactly the same position. So your resultant vector would be exactly the same. This rule is called your associative rule for the addition of vectors. This is tested more in A-level context than in GCSE context. In GCSE context, you tend to stick with just two vectors. The last rule that is worth adding to your repository of information applies to when you have a scalar quantity and two vectors. So let's look at an example of a scalar quantity with S and two vectors P and Q. This rule says that if we multiply our resultant vectors, then in effect, we're multiplying our component by exactly the same thing, exactly the same scalar quantity. Let us represent this using a diagram. So let's go back to our two vectors Q and P. If I have my resultant, represented by my black line, P plus Q. If I doubled my resultant, what this rule tells me is that I have in effect doubled each component. So my resultant, 2 lots of P plus Q, is equals to 2P plus 2Q. This is called the distributive rule for addition of vectors.